Part 4. Good news, bad news. Even Miles was surprised when he looked at the alarm clock in his bedroom. It was 8:30 in the morning. Unbelievable, he muttered. He tried to recollect the last time he'd been up so early for 3 days on the trot. He picked up the phone and called Tate, feeling sure she would be surprised that he was up and about at such an early hour, at least for him. No answer. Why am I not surprised? He whispered. He left a message while pouring a coffee and walked into his studio. Another 15 minutes and he'd be working. He set the alarm clock for 11:30, not wanting to risk being late and the consequential damage to his lungs and heart. He felt keen to get started and was impatient that his old Atari sequencing computer took so long to boot up. Miles looked at his notes. The lyrics were almost finished. He tried to imagine how he wanted the song to sound. "We changed, we grew up," he repeated several times. "Mystical. Yes, mystical," he said, talking to himself. Miles almost jumped through the roof when his concentration was broken by a loud banging on the garage door. "We know you're in there! We know you're in there!" came the chant. "You can't escape! You are the devil!" His heart pounding, Miles squinted through a small gap in the side of the garage door. "Shit! Fuck!" he thought. The 4 Indian Asian men looked angry. Miles had totally forgotten that he owed $170 for the repair of audio equipment some 3 months ago. The men continued to bang on the door. Miles shrugged his shoulders. He was penniless until Friday and only had a small jar of quarters that Tate saved in the kitchen. He decided to sit it out. Surely they would give up. He slumped onto a drum stool and stared at the wall, drifting into a dream world as the banging and name-calling continued. The dream gradually became a reality for Miles as he began to imagine all 4 men sitting cross-legged on the floor of the garage, dressed in Indian formal attire with sitars, tablas and violins, smiling as they accompanied him musically. His trance-like state was broken by a final thump on the garage door and a loud shout. "We'll be back! You won't get away with this, Mr. Miles!" One final kick at the door and they were gone. He heard the men gabbling in their native language as they walked down the short driveway towards their van. Another thing to sort out, he mused, shaking his head. At least he knew how his latest creation would sound. James strolled into the offices of Chevalier's. He was feeling low, but his upbringing enabled him to appear completely in control. For all intents and purposes, he was in control. This was his domain, his forte. The young woman in reception passed him a note, which he read immediately without glancing at the receptionist. "Thank you," said James. "You're welcome, Mr. Lindsay. You are cordially invited to an in-house preview of our latest ranges on Friday night at 7 p.m. Dress informally and feel free to bring your partner. The note was signed Vin. James would have to go, but it really wasn't his type of event. Dress informally, he thought. What does that mean? He was acutely aware that informal in his world could be differently perceived in the fashion world. He was still contemplating Friday night when he strode into the lift, unaware of anyone or anything else. The lift was half full. Angela was surely the most beautiful woman James had ever seen. He felt embarrassed in her presence. She barely looked at him, and he tried desperately to focus on anything other than her. He felt like dying as the lift emptied and he found himself alone, albeit with only one floor to travel, with this gorgeous woman. "Good morning," said Angela. "Morning," James stammered, with "nice weather." "You idiot, what are you saying?" thought James. "Well, it is California," said Angela. She looked directly at James and smiled. James wished the floor would open and swallow him up. The lift doors opened and she walked down the corridor with James a step behind her. "See you later then," she teased him. Yes," said James meekly. Yes," more assertively, as he recovered his composure. Angela opened her office door, walked in and shut the door behind her. So that's A. Holman, thought James, his eyes focusing on Angela's door. James was still focused on her door when he strode into the floor-standing rubber plant opposite Angela's door. He managed to catch it before it fell over completely, but some leaves fell off and he desperately picked them up and jammed them into the soil in the plant's pot. The last thing he remembered of the incident were the blinds in Angela's office snapping shut as he picked up his attaché case and headed for his new office next to Vincent's. It took James a full 10 minutes to regain his composure. "Why are you like this? What a fool, you idiot," he muttered to himself as he unpacked the files which were bound on his desk, laying them out in order. He had already decided to avoid Angela for a few days, hoping she would forget the incident. She wouldn't. James locked himself away all morning, studying the files Vincent had left for him, making copious notes. All thoughts of his embarrassing start to the day banished from his mind. At 1 o'clock there was a knock on his office door. "Come in," he called, barely looking up from his work. "Good afternoon, Mr. Lindsay," said Denise. "I have some more files for you, and Mr. Earl says he won't be in until Thursday. If you need to reach him, I have telephone numbers where he can be contactable," she added. "Thank you, Denise. By the way, I met a young woman who occupies the first-floor office on the right. Can you tell me who she is?" asked James. "That's Angela Holman. She's our top designer." "Do you want to see her?" said Denise. No, just interested. I wanted to know who I'm working with." "Thank you, Denise." James could have kicked himself. Angela had really got under his skin. Angela smiled to herself. He was very starchy and extremely straight, but he had kind eyes and a presence, she thought. It amused her to replay the incident in the lift and the corridor over and over. She had already gone to great lengths to find out about him from the moment she saw him on the previous Friday. He was a sportsman. No, a sporting hero. He looked strong. No, powerful. She pondered as she flicked through some designs on her desk. Angela was having a good day. She wondered about James all weekend. There was something about him. Saturday night wasn't too good, she conceded to herself. She had resorted to a cocktail of antidepressants and alcohol to kill time, but Sunday she'd been very good. No pills at all. She picked up a handful of design sketches and headed down to her other office on the design floor. She wanted to make some colour changes. She stared up at the corridor towards James's office, hoping he would emerge and provide her with more fun before turning and walking towards the lift. Mars was beginning to feel a bit low again. Tate had not responded to any of his calls. He owed $170 to some mad Asians and his bike didn't work. He sauntered to work, shoulders hunched, head bowed, and arrived with a full 10 minutes to spare. He knocked politely, in case Pat had returned unexpectedly, before opening the door and letting himself in. He looked around the bar. Everything looked so miserable. It started to match his mood. He remembered what his father had always said to him. "Life is what you make of it. Nothing happens to those who don't try to make life work. There's nothing worse than a man who has brains and doesn't use them." Miles wondered what he could do under the circumstances. The bar certainly needed some attention. The tables and chairs were old and worn. A coat of lacquer on the bar wouldn't go amiss. He resolved to ask Pat whether he could sand down the bar and tidy things up a bit. He wandered towards the pool tables and tripped on the carpet that covered the floor under and around the pool tables, barely managing to keep himself upright. He massaged his right ankle, which was twisted in the trip. "Ooh, that's painful," he gasped. He pulled back the edge of the worn carpet to examine the floor underneath. The timber had changed colour. In fact, it was a different wood altogether, and there were some small lights let into the edging. Miles peeled back the carpet in various locations around the perimeter and found that within 6 inches from the edge of the carpet there was a wooden edging containing lights. Pat walked into the bar at 8. He looked awful, and Miles could tell that it wasn't a good time to talk shop. There were only a handful of people in the bar, but Pat wasn't noticing anything. Miles walked over to Pat and put his hand on Pat's shoulder. "Are you okay?" he asked. "She's dying, son." "Dying," said Pat, his eyes welling up with tears. "I'm so sorry. If I can help in any way, I will," said Miles gently. "You're a good boy. If you can just look after things. I'm just going to get changed and go back to the hospital," said Pat, and with that he went upstairs. Pat returned 10 minutes later and asked Miles to keep everything going. Claire died at 11:30 that night. "Life is a strange thing," said Pat. "One minute you're here, and the next—" He paused. "You're— well, you know, son," he said, pouring another Irish whiskey. "Claire and I, we had such good times. We never argued, you know. Except for how long it was going to take me to ask her to marry me." He forced a smile. Miles and Pat sat with each other to the early hours of the morning. Miles rarely said anything. Pat recounted memory after memory of his days with his beloved Claire. At 5 in the morning, Miles helped Pat upstairs to bed and locked up and walked home in a sombre mood. It put things into a different perspective for Miles. He realised how much Tate meant to him, how much life meant to him, and that he had to make everything work if he possibly could. James hadn't noticed the time. It was late, about 8. He hadn't meant to stay at work so late, but he had been absorbed by his work. He wanted to go for a jog. As he walked down the corridor towards the lift and past the cleaners, he saw Angela's light was still on in her office. For a moment he stopped and thought about seeing if she was still working, but carried on towards the lift. Curious, he thought, a young woman working so late. He dismissed his thoughts as he remembered the forthcoming party and entered the lift. The lift doors were just closing when John put his arm through the gap. The doors sprung open and John stepped in. My, you've been quiet today," he cooed. "I've been amusing myself with sales figures," replied James. "Found anything interesting yet?" asked John. "You're working late," said James, changing the subject. "Want a quick game of racquetball?" said John, ignoring James's remark. "I haven't got a racket," said James. "I've got a few you can choose from." "I know it's not the same, but a man with your reputation," replied John. "I'll just take my attaché down to the car and pick up my sports bag and see you in 5, said James. John smiled. He was an extremely good player and would enjoy handing James a lesson. He also knew that beating someone on court gave a man a certain type of superiority in the workplace. He was a master of one-upmanship. "In that case, I'll just go back to my office and see you in 5, said John. "Fine, 5 it is," replied James. James did not expect an audience when he arrived at the courts. Various members of staff had finished activities in the gym, and John had been holding court. "Here he is, it's LA v Boston," he announced animatedly, gesturing towards James. "Best of 3? inquired John. "That would be fine," said James. "I'll be match referee," called out a young man. Both men ignored him as they stepped onto court. The mood had changed, both men deadly serious. After a short knock-up, they flipped a coin for service and the game was on. James was not surprised by the athleticism of his slightly more mature opponent. He had already worked out that this was more than just a game to John. John proved very agile and more than competent opponent, and James lost the first game by a good margin. In the second game, James became more comfortable with his racket and John's game, and won by 2 points. The decider had become do or die for both players, as each man felt there was more at stake than pride. The game seesawed backwards and forwards, James winning by 2 points again. John's eyes burnt into James as they shook hands. Neither man spoke. John left immediately. "Good game," someone called out. "Well done, he's never been beaten," another voice. James took a shower and packed away his soaked kit into a plastic bag before ramming them into his sports bag. He was quietly pleased with his victory and whistled as he made for the car park. He walked across to his car, pressed his key to open the doors and made his way to the trunk. As he lifted the trunk, Angela called out, "Good night, great game," and she waved to him. "Yeah, thanks," called James. "Yeah, good night." Why does that always happen with that woman? James winced. He saw her alpha spider pull away and she was gone, and he was left staring at the exit of the car park. James arrived home at 10. He hadn't played a game like that for months. At least there was no need to go for a jog. He wandered over to his answering machine. No messages. His thoughts turned to Chrislyn and he poured himself a red wine. He made a sandwich, sipped the wine, drank half the glass and went to bed, his mind spinning. Miles didn't wake until 11. He thought he was dreaming when he heard the phone ringing. It was Tate. He missed her call and cursed his luck. He phoned her back and left another message before listening to a message she had left for him. "Hi, it's me. I dropped by, but you were in bed, as usual. I left an envelope in the kitchen with $250 inside. At least the house was tidy. Still at Mum's, but thinking of going away for a while." The message ended. "What? She can't be serious," exclaimed Miles. He tried Tate at work, but he had no idea what her shift times were, and she wasn't there. He left a long, convoluted message on her mobile answering service pleading innocence at his alleged lying, and got dressed. "Going away? What for? Where to? What's going on?" he hissed. Miles barely had time to eat, and he was on his way to work. As he stepped from the front porch, 3 Asians accosted him. "You are the blacklegs of the forest," the oldest one said. "You'll be wanting money," said Miles. "Hold on, I'll get it." To the astonishment of the Asian men, Miles paid them the money he owed and walked off to work with $80 left in his pocket. The door was already open when Miles arrived at the bar. He immediately noticed the 2 packed suitcases sitting by the entrance inside the bar. He felt an impending doom. He'd already given plenty of thought to how he would behave and what he would say to Pat that morning. Pat appeared from the curtain that separated the bar from the stairs leading to his flat. "Morning, son," he said. "Good morning, Pat. How are you today?" replied Miles. "Not so bad. I spent a lot of time on the phone with my relatives in Chicago this morning, and I'm going to spend some time with them. My heart's not in this place right now. Listen, son, I've left your money for the week on my desk upstairs. If you want, you can close the place right now and we'll call it quits. Otherwise, I'll be in touch. You can take your wages out of the takings and I'll be back in about a month. I'll understand if you go. A fellow like you must have plenty of things to do with your life. If you stay, you're on your own till I get back. I've made arrangements about Claire and there's nothing keeping me here." Miles and Pat hugged and Miles assured Pat of his support. Pat left Chicago. Miles contemplated his options.